Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Robin Bolton. I'm the Senior Crops Development Advisor with CAFRE. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event, although typically when we pick a date for an event and go for it, it always seems to turn out to be a good evening, just when many or maybe hopefully some of you are able to watch even you are in the combine, but if you are, please do keep an eye on the cutter bar. We don't want any major accidents as a result. This evening is the second event on protein crops, following on from an earlier event in the year which discussed the growing of protein crops in Northern Ireland and the potential for their use in dairy cow diets. This event is planned to provide an update on the uptake of the DAERA Protein Crops Pilot Support Scheme and to provide growers growing these crops for the first time with some advice and guidance around their harvesting and storage. This will be backed up by some practical tips from Charlie Kilpatrick, who farms near Moira and has been growing beans for 7 years now. Tonight's event will be recorded, so if you know of anybody who's missed it, it will be available through the CAFRE website at a later date. You will also have the opportunity throughout the event to submit questions. Some already have via email, but throughout the event, if you're on a laptop, you can submit questions using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a mobile or a tablet user, you have to access the question and answers by the 3-dot icon, which appears when you tap your mobile device screen. Please submit your questions using the All Panelists option, and we will try to answer as many of these questions as we can after the presentations. So at this stage, I will move on to our first speaker. I'm pleased to introduce Dawn Morrow. Dawn is Head of Dairy, Pigs, Poultry and Crops branch at CAFRE and has been involved in the rollout of the Protein Crops Pilot Support Scheme from the early stage. So I'll hand over to Dawn now, who will provide an update on the uptake of the scheme. Over to you, Dawn.
Thanks, Robin. Folks, I'm not going to take that long, but we just thought that as we are covering the harvest and storage, it'd be useful just to look back on how the scheme has gone this year to date, and maybe just some points that you may want to consider if you're thinking of growing the crop next year. So in terms of how this year went, Lee, if you wouldn't mind, we'll just take the next slide. There were 100 claims made at single farm payment time for the protein crop scheme. Of those, 80 were this went down to 80. Most of those were folk. Most of the 20 that were disallowed were folk who perhaps accidentally picked the protein crop payment box, but didn't actually have any eligible crops in their field list. That was the vast majority of those, and then there were a few that maybe had potentially identified crops in their field list, but hadn't claimed the payment, and subsequently didn't wish to take it forward. So we were down to 80 applications. Of those 80 applications, 10 were then selected for inspection in July, and all of those inspections went fine. There were no significant issues. All of the crops were growing well, were reasonably clean, good husbandry, and areas matched reasonably closely. There were a couple that were grown as parts of fields, and there were small adjustments made there where farmers had maybe estimated the difference slightly differently. But there were no issues at inspection. So in total, there was a total area determined following inspection and confirmation of 680 hectares. So that was below well below the upper limit of 1,000 hectares that had been set for this year, and that means that the amount payable will be 225 or 224,500 pounds this year. So that will be paid out. Now, in terms of the actual crops that were grown, as you can see here, field beans are by far the largest proportion of those. Almost 600 hectares of that 750 or 600 hectares were field beans. The next was spring peas. Then we had a small area of winter field beans, 23 hectares, and 15 hectares of sweet lupins. And that's as we would have expected, given the popularity of spring beans in this part of the world. But that's how we worked out this year. So that's the program for this year past. In terms of looking forward to next year, and this is exactly the same conditions that were applied to this year, the payment rate will be £330 per hectare. The total area eligible will be capped at 1,000 hectares for this year and last year. And that's an annual budget. There's no carryover from previous years. So we have allocated a budget of £330,000 maximum for next year. If there is more than 1,000 hectares grown or determined to be eligible next year, then there will be a scale back, and it will be scaled back proportionately in terms of area. And we will make the payment based on that scale back area. So everyone will be equally affected in terms of the scale back. Okay, so that's the scheme next year as it was this year. In terms of the eligible crops, they are exactly the same, and I would expect that there'll be the same proportion of crops grown because of the suitability for local conditions. And it's just another reminder that the forage crops such as clover, alfalfa, lucerne are not eligible for aid under the scheme. These 5 crops are the only ones that are eligible at this moment in time. So that's just a very quick run through how the scheme has gone this year. And having got it now to the stage where it needs to be harvested, I'll pass you back to Robin, who can take you through with our other speakers the actual practicalities of getting that harvest and storage carried out. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. It's good to see that there was a reasonable level of uptake of the scheme when it was put through. That's been encouraging. And I suppose that takes us on to, as Don said, to the next section tonight, which is really to look at, having got this far, some advice and tips around harvesting the crop. So Lee, many of you will know, Lee is a Caffrey Crops Development Advisor currently working with growers in the eastern region around County Down. Lee's interest in protein crops comes from work he did as a crops technologist back in his early years of Caffrey, I think going back to 2013, growing spring beans at Loughry campus. This has continued through his work as a development advisor with farmers in County Down now. Lee will be assisted this evening by Charlie Kilpatrick. Charlie, many of you know, is an arable farmer based near Hillsborough, County Down. Charlie grows wheat, barley and beans in rotation, along with grass and land let for potatoes and conacre. Farm also runs some Aberdeen Angus based suckler cow herd. So at this point, I'll hand over to Lee, who will take us through the rest of the session.
Okay, folks, we're going to cover the harvest and storage of protein crops. As Robin said, myself and Charlie will be going through this. So I suppose maybe just at this point, Charlie, would you like to say hello?
Yeah, Lee. Thanks, Lee. Folks, I appreciate the invitation tonight to speak about my experience growing combinable beans, and hope it'll give you some guidance on practical take-home messages. This is my 7th year of growing beans as a break crop. I was firstly grown in 2015 as an EFA in 2015 as part of the new subsidy regime. I think your covering slide there with the New Holland harvester was actually my first field of boxer beans that year, which yielded about 2 tons to the acre. I think one of the things tonight, folks, the emphasis tonight is spring beans as a break crop, and it will do well, but it won't achieve the margins as a good crop of winter barley or winter wheat. But I find it has suited my land extremely well, and it has significant advantages in other ways as a break crop. My rotation over the last 7 or 8 years has been 2 crops of winter wheat, first wheat, second wheat, followed by 2 crops of winter barley. And then I go back into a break of either grass, potatoes or spring beans. As with potatoes, beans don't suit all of my fields or all of my land. And I have selected fields that suit each crop. The main criteria for my spring beans is those fields which have a greater chance of sowing in March, and as early as March as possible. That's been one of my key themes of growing beans. Each of the years, I say a target to have sown by the 17th of March. And this year, we had a really dry spring, and they were in on the 6th of March, so it's probably the earliest year. And a result is probably a knock on from that was published the earliest date of Desiccated. So as the evening goes on, I'm going to hand back to Lee on, and we're going to touch on the advantages, disadvantages, pros and cons as we go through the presentation tonight. And I think you're coming back to me with a series of questions, which I'll touch on some of the issues, which are significant take-home messages. Thanks, Lee.
Okay, thank you, Charlie. I think it was interesting you said that sort of what got you into it at the start was the need for EFA in 2015, and I suppose that is there's a few people started growing spring beans around that time, and quite a few of them sort of have stuck with it. So I think it'll be interesting to hear Charlie's view on the whole thing, that he sort of has stuck with them since then. So what we're going to cover this evening, I'm going to go back very, very briefly to what we covered in March in the webinar then. And one of the slides was the considerations before growing protein crops. So I'm going to go back to that. I'm going to touch a wee bit on marketing. And then we're going to look at the management of the crop pre-harvest. We'll look a wee bit at harvest itself. And then we'll cover some of the post-harvest treatment options and some of the things that you maybe need to watch out for or need to consider. And then, as I said, after that, we'll bring Charlie back in, and I'll sort of put a few questions to him, and we'll sort of have a bit of a discussion between ourselves. So any questions you have, as Robin said, please put them in, and we'll try to get to them if I haven't already by the end of this evening. So going back to the event in March, and I had this slide up then, and I suppose anybody that ever approaches me or has ever said, well, what about growing, well, I suppose any new crop, but spring beans or a protein crop in particular, I would say there's a number of considerations. And the two that I sort of want to focus on this evening are, can I get them harvested, and can I find a market for them? The last one there, can I find a market for them? That's the one that I would say is probably the most important. There are some markets locally for protein crops, but they're not just as widely available as if you were growing cereals. So you maybe have to work a wee bit harder. So I would hope those of you who are joining us this evening that have protein crops in have already got that sort of sorted out. But for those that don't, you need to get busy in the next while to make sure that you have that tied up. So what are the marketing options? And I suppose really they fall into three broad categories here. For those who are mixed farmers, can use them as livestock feed on your own farm. Alternatively, for the same reason, sell them to neighbouring farms. Or the third option is local feed mills. Now, not all local feed mills will be interested in taking beans, but there are some out there who are quite keen to use them and include them in their rations. And I suppose regardless of what option you go for, the important thing I would say is that the end use determines your post-harvest treatment. So you need to speak to, if you're selling them, whether it's a neighbour or a mill, you need to speak to them and see what way they want them. Are they happy enough to take them off the combine? Is moisture an issue? What moisture do they want them cut at? What can you deliver them at? Is it something they want a dried product? Are they happy to take a wet product, or do they want further treatment? Like in the photograph there, those are beans that have been crimped and popcorned, and that was taken of somebody who was delivering those to further customers. So now is the time to sort of, if you haven't already got it agreed, speak to your customer to see what way they want them. Same for storage, when are they to be delivered? Is it the end of harvest, or is it through the winter time? All those things, it's useful now to get sorted out, because that will affect how you treat the crop during harvest and after harvest. So we'll take a wee step back and sort of look at the pre-harvest management. The photograph that you can see there taken on the right hand side was of a crop of beans outside Downpatrick taken last week. And that's probably the way quite a few crops are starting to look now. Leaves have maybe gone off them. You can see there's some black plants in there, and there's still bits of green and maybe a bit variable looking. So the question that we want to be asking ourselves now are, do crops need desiccated? There's really three circumstances where you would consider going through and spraying them off with glyphosate. And the first one is, are they weedy? Weed control is something that I sort of made a point of is quite important whenever you're putting in your protein crops. Get it on pre-emergent because there's not an awful lot of options post-emergence. I would say of the crops I seen that worked fairly well this year, even though it was quite a dry spring. There was some rain sort of a wee bit later on, and that seemed to work quite well. The only issue being when it comes to this time of year, and this happens most years, as the leaves start to fall off the crops, you tend to find that a bit more light gets in at the bottom, and we usually get wet in August at some stage, so that gives you maybe a late flush of weeds. So you might consider desiccation if the crop's weedy. The second is the crop ripening variable, and this is something I would say particularly I've seen quite a bit of this year. We had a very prolonged dry spell there through June and into July it got quite warm. And what you tend to see is that in fields where there's a bit of variation in the soil type, where it's a little bit lighter, they've maybe died off that bit earlier. They're already black, in some cases probably close ready to harvest. However, bits that have held on to moisture a bit better, maybe heavier ground, valley bottoms, that sort of thing, they're maybe still quite a way off harvest. So if that's the case, then possibly desiccation could be quite useful for sort of evening those crops up before harvest. And then the third one is late harvest going to be an issue for you? If you're wanting to bring that sort of harvest date forward a wee bit, desiccation might be something worth considering. Now, for some people, that's not an issue. Looking at that crop there, that grower was fairly relaxed. As I said, that was taken about a week ago. So just after the middle of August, it was starting to turn already. And we sort of estimated 3 to 4 weeks that should be ready to harvest. Mid-September, where he was quite comfortable with that, no issues. So sort of that wasn't his reason for doing it. But if your crops are looking quite a bit greener, there's still quite a bit of leaf on it, then it might be something that you would consider desiccating just to bring it in a wee bit quicker. In terms of desiccation timing, advice from the PGRO would be whenever, with beans, whenever 90% of the pods are black. I would say in sort of experience we've had with them over here, it's maybe a wee bit earlier than that, anything from about 2/3 to 3/4 of pods black, so about 60–70% of them. That's maybe when you would consider going in, and again that'll be might even be more than or even a lower percentage of them black if its variability is an issue in the field. In terms of peas, it's whenever moisture content is around about 30%, although with peas, desiccation isn't really recommended and not usually a need for it. They do tend to come in that bit earlier and not so much of an issue. So harvest itself, when to harvest? With peas, they would say that anything below 25% moisture content can be harvested. Now this has to be balanced, I would say, because the issue with peas is, as you can see in that photograph there, they're very close to the ground, and they can be very difficult to harvest when they get like that. So yes, we want them drier because that'll make the drying of the crop easier in store, and it'll also cost less, but that has to be balanced with how well is that crop standing. So what I would say is yes, below 25%, but before the crop lodges. If you've see that you're below 25% and there's a lot of heavy rain or heavy winds forecast, I would sort of say, yeah, you want to push to get them off. Whereas if you've got the crop gets to below 25% and you're still in a good weather window, yeah, you can leave it a bit longer. With beans, however, that's not so much of an issue. Beans do stand an awful lot better than peas do, and that was one of the things we highlighted as sort of being the strengths of them whenever we talked about the different protein crops back in March. And with beans, it's whenever the majority of the plants in the pods are black. And as you can see in this photograph on the right hand side is a fairly good example of that. Everything's sort of got that blackened dead look about it, and then you've got one nice green plant right in the middle. You will always get that, and I think every field of beans I've ever seen has always had those few green plants in the middle. So you don't wait till they're black. It's whenever the majority of them are black. And again, it's just as long as you can leave them to let the moisture drop in the field. that you're comfortable with. Obviously, if weather windows are a bit catchy and a bit short, you get a chance you get them off. And again, if it's getting later on in the year, you probably don't want to hang on too long because you don't want to delay getting in your following winter cereal. So in terms of harvest, sort of just maybe look at a few combine setup tips. What you tend to find with probably all protein crops is that most combine losses tend to occur at the header. You don't lose that much through the combine, out the back of the combine, but you can lose quite a bit at the header itself. Particularly if you get conditions like you see in the photograph here, blue skies, crops nice and dry. As it dries out, the pods, whether they be bean pods or pea pods, get brittle, and as they get brittle, any sort of movement then, or a bit of movement then can cause them to shatter out. So things that you sort of want to look for is, if you can do, raise your reel up out of the way or as far as practically possible and slow it down. The other thing maybe as well is crop lifters. As the second point I've said there, they can be useful in laid crops or partially laid crops. However, if you've got too many lifters on, sometimes they can actually have the opposite effect. So they sort of shake the plants before they get as far as the knife, and you could be losing some grain before you ever get them into the header. So again, that's one just sort of playing about to see the best sort of setup you can get there. But it is something to note that you can lose quite a bit at the header. In terms of the cutter bar itself, you really only need to go as low as the lowest pods. In this photograph here, you can see that's been shaved off nice and clean. But in that crop, there were pods sort of maybe only 2-3 inches off the ground, so had to go low to get them all. Some years that's a feature, just the way the growth seems to go. Other years you tend to get them podding much higher up, possibly anything sort of 9-12 inches or above. So there's no need just to shave every last wee bit of it off if that's the sort of crop that you've got. Protein crops also tend to be quite easily threshed. And I suppose that's worth mentioning that, if you can lower the drum speed and open the concave up, you're maybe damaging the straw less, shattering it less, and sort of less overload of the sieves. And if that's the case, that sort of can be important further down the line and giving you a clean sample. Clean sample can be quite important because depending on how you're going to treat the crop after harvest, if you've got a nice clean sample and you don't have any of that sort of straw in there, that won't hold on to moisture and won't give you problems in stores. So if you can do, slow down the drum and open up the concave. I would say the exception to that is if you're harvesting in tricky conditions. Yes, they will harvest whenever there's a bit of damp about. If that's the case, or there's still a bit of green in the stalks, you probably don't want to slow it down too far, for you don't want to risk blocking the combine. So again, you'll know yourself the sort of the conditions. If conditions are good, like in that photograph, slow everything down a wee bit, open it up, and you should get a nice clean sample. Open the sieves to minimize your losses. As I said, you don't get a lot of losses. Both peas and beans are a heavy grain, so they do tend to fall down in there. High fan speed, if you open the sieves up, high fan speed gets all that rubbish out the back of the combine and will give you a cleaner sample. And as I've said, that can be quite important when it comes to storage. And another wee trick is if you remove the cover at the bottom of the returns elevator, because it's quite a heavy seed, you don't tend to get a lot of grain coming back through in the returns. So if you take that cover off, it just lets that trash out. It means it's not recycling it around the combine again and overloading your sieves. So once we've got harvest taken care of, what are the post-harvest treatment options? And I'm sort of divide them broadly into two here. There's drying and then there's sort of moist storage. When drying, you want to aim for 14% for long-term storage. And as I say, aim for 14%. After the crop's dried, you'll find as it's cooling, it might suck in a wee bit of moisture, and it should store, quite comfortably at 15-16%. Okay, but again, that's something you want to check with whoever's taking them. If you've agreed 14% or 15%, then that's what you obviously have to get it below. Peas And I suppose particularly beans are large seed, so moisture is slow to release and to get out of them. And as a result of that, they do tend to suit high airflow, lower temperature drying. So if you have a drying floor where you can either blow heated air through it or ambient air through it, those will work quite well at drying the crop out. Yes, it takes longer, but I suppose particularly with beans, the chances are that's the last crop you're going to be harvesting in the season. So if you have a drying floor, there's the potential that they can stay on it once you've everything else dried and out of the way. If you're using a continuous flow or a batch dryer, particularly high moisture content crops may need to be dried incrementally. So, once you get over 20%, 22%, you'll struggle to take all that out in one go. So it might be a case of running it through, taking out 3, 4, 5%, and then running it through again just to bring it down below to your desired moisture content. One thing to note, and this is sort of one of the reasons I hear that people have sort of stayed away from trying to dry them through a batch dryer, is that they are heavy. Both peas and beans are quite heavy, quite a lot heavier than wheat. So they can be hard on drives and on dryer components. So again, consult your manufacturers, your dryer manufacturer's guide on what their settings are. I've seen cases where people have, put them in the even continuous flow dryer, kept the bed depth the same, and next thing it sort of busts the trace chain. So, look at what the settings are in the manufacturers to sort of get the best results out of it. Once the crop's dried, ideally you would like to ventilate them to cool them down, and this will stop molds developing. As I said, it's a big seed, so it does tend to be slow to release moisture, and it may all, as it's cooling down and that moisture comes out as it cools down, then condensation can form. So if you can ventilate, it sort of stops that turning into a mold then. And I suppose really, as I would advise with any crop, is once you have it dried and put it into store, it's not a case of just shutting the door until you want to unload it again, but do monitor regularly, particularly if this is something that you've been doing for the first time. You want to get a feel for how the crop reacts and sort of how it behaves in store. With moist storage, a lot of people maybe aren't wanting to dry it or don't have the facilities to dry it. So what else can you do with it? Well, for untreated grain, something that's combined below 18%, it is possible, with a bit of ventilation to manage that, particularly sort of for short to medium term storage periods. But again, it's a case of if you're doing that, if you're blowing air through pedestals or something like that, or if you're simply shifting them around from one part of the store to the other, just to keep monitoring that and keep watching what the crop's doing. Once we get above 18%, you need to give a bit more consideration to doing something else with them. And you'd like to treat for longer term store, particularly things that are crops that are going to be stored for long term. So probably the most common treatment has been propionic acid, and that can either be treating the whole grains, or what works quite well and sort of what we have done in the past is crimped them and treated them with prop corn at harvest or just shortly after harvest. I suppose the one thing is, since we talked in March, it has become a bit of an issue getting hold of prop corn this year. So again, if it's something you haven't already got a supply of, you want to be making a few inquiries. There are some alternatives out there, although some of the other caustic treatments or urea treatments are untested on beans and on peas. Yes, commonly used on cereal grains, but largely untested when it comes to protein crops. So again, it's a case of speaking to whoever's manufacturing that and seeing what's their recommendations. And again, with these, anything moist stored, I would say just as importantly is to monitor regularly, particularly if it's something that you haven't been used to working with and growing in the past. So that is really all I want to cover. I think at this point, I'll invite Charlie back in. I suppose we have covered some of these questions already, Charlie, but you said you've been growing beans for 7 years, yeah?
Yeah, as I say, Liz, I started in 2015 using the beans primarily for an ecological focus area. And I did it a second year, and as you know, after the third year, they weren't needed for an EFA unless you were growing them organically. So I kept going, and I became more confident as the years went on, and I'm increased now. I'm growing between 10 and 20 acres per year. This year, the variety I'm standing was a variety called Fuego. In the past, I've used varieties Vertigo and Boxer have been the two main ones. What has really encouraged me, and I've noticed, is the following crop of first wheat. It really, really benefits the soil obviously through the nitrogen retaining from the legume to establish the crop in the autumn. And I'm very confident that in my sandy loam soils, the buildup of organic matter through chopping the straw in and through the root system, it certainly gives me a much better soil at a good establishment. But it's the crop of wheat afterwards. You're into 4.5 tons easily. And second to grass, that's the best break crop I've used. Now, some people ask me why I don't use oilseed rape. Well, I've had mixed success with oilseed rape in the past. Oilseed rape may give a slightly better, or maybe a better gross margin. But through the last 7 years, I've had consistent yields. As I said, I got more confident with it. And the yields are varying between 1.8 to slightly over 2 tons per acre. And as I say, it has done well for me, and I've enjoyed doing it, and probably got better at it as the years have went on.
Okay.
So
it's interesting that you make that point, Charlie, that on your ground it's a fairly consistent yielder, because if we think back to March, we had Simon Best was sort of on, and he was chatting about his experience, and that's one thing Simon said is it was that he found it was quite a variability, and that's sort of good reason for sort of having the support payment. So I suppose it is encouraging to hear from another grower who's been growing for a number of years to say that on your soil type and in your farm that it's actually quite a consistent performer. I suppose that's a useful thing to hear. In terms of your market, Charlie, what do you do with the beans? I mean, you have cattle as well. Are you using them on your own farm, or?
Well, I use some of them. As I say, I creep feed my calves in the autumn, and obviously they're high protein, high starch, and the mix. I mix that with a barley mix, obviously to keep a good protein level on it. But I say one of the key messages tonight is, and it was a sell before you grow, and you need to find someone. In my case, I have a local dairy farmer who has realised the benefits of the high protein and high starch for both dairy cows and particularly dairy young stock, the high protein value, which he mixes in with his complete diet feeds. I encourage anyone to seek out and confirm a market even before you grow it. Make sure you've got that covered. The customer I have likes them crimped. I have a grain dryer, but as you've said earlier on, it's a continuous flow. From what I'm hearing from other farmers, it can be hard on the machine. And also, I've also heard if you let them go for 20 minutes or half an hour longer than they should, they can come out very hard and like marbles in some cases if you aren't managed it very closely. So it can be quite tricky to get them dried right through a grain dryer. As I say, the crimp product suits my customer best, so it works well for me, it has done so for the last 7 years, and I like to keep that customer happy with a good product every year.
Okay, so your treatment then, Harvest, talk us through it. It's crimped and prop corned.
It's crimped. I like to do it within 24 hours. Now, funny, the crop behind the picture behind me there was burnt. That was taken last Friday, Lee, wasn't it? So it was burnt off the week before. So next week I'm hoping to have that combined. I've already been on with a contractor who does my crimping to forewarn them, and I like to have them there, if not the next day, the day after that. They would be around 20% moisture content ideally. Now there's been, I think there was one wet year 3 years ago, they were probably higher on that, but we got them sorted okay. So they come in, they're crimped. Now, if you can't get them crimped the next day, my advice is if they're around 20% higher, move the pile at least once every 24 hours. Don't let them heat up on you. and I think we're putting on something like somewhere between 10 and 12 litres of propionic acid per tonne. Now, I got wind of the shortage of prop corn earlier on in the year, and I was able to source some, so I have it and store it at the minute. And I realise it could be a problem for other people, although I've recently heard I think it may be more available in the next few weeks. I'm not sure about that. So, yeah. Okay. Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And in terms of the run up to harvest, there you mentioned that crop has already been desiccated, so you obviously do that. Is that something you do every year, or is it something you sort of take on a year by year basis, or sort of what's your driver for doing it? Is it for weed control, or
there's probably three things there. There's even ripening. To kill any trash weeds, there can be weeds come up. It does get one herbicide after it sows. You may have trouble with some weeds, and so you want to get those sorted. But for early harvest, and one tip I followed, and it comes from another farmer from a few years ago, I make sure and have them desiccated before the last day of August, because you're going to need 2 weeks plus for the Roundup to work. And I'm going on with glyphosate with the wetter, and at least 14 days, maybe 20, probably 20 before we get in. Now this year, this last 2 years, I've used a contractor who has a self-propelled sprayer with high ground clearance and GPS, because one of the things you will find, if this crop is tall, and it's not so tall this year, other years it's been well over the top of the bonnet of my spray tractor, and it's difficult to see the other end of the field. And your tram lines aren't there. If you haven't got GPS, you certainly do knock all the pods off where you drive and destroy. So if you can get, as I say, high ground clears, 24-meter sprayer with GPS, you do at least damage as possible. Again, spraying this year, I think the drought had a factor in bringing this on a bit early. I desiccated on the 12th of August. It's usually into the 3rd week of August before I think of spraying, maybe the last week of August in a couple of years. It's 50% plus of the pods are black, and the leaves are starting to really die off. Probably 60% pods black, the bottom of them green. And funny you should say that field I'm standing in, there were patches of that are very dry. It is a sandy loam, and it is patchy. There are some areas of that, and we looked at that last week where the pods are black to the ground. There's other places where the pods are green halfway up. So I'm hoping this day next week that will be harvested, and next week. So yeah.
Okay. And in terms of the straw, Charlie, have you have you ever tried to bale that, or sort of? What's your way of dealing with it?
I think this is one of the key things about a break crop, to chop that straw back in again. You're building up organic matter, you're probably putting a bit of potash and phosphate back in again. And certainly when you look at I have sandy loam soils. That particular field there is very loamy, and it builds up the organic matter. Certainly you can see the friable, better draining soils afterwards, and I think that is part of the key to my trump card the next year in my first wheat when I'm getting that big yield. It's really improving the soil structure, and perhaps that's, I look at the environmental aspect of this. I couldn't help but think of the amount of bees that were in this crop when it was flowering back in the springtime, and you're putting back in organic matter, you're improving your soil structure, and I suppose that's, your soil health is sort of key to all of this, and getting a consistent, as I say, yield off all your crops per year. And I'm saying, the yield, the gross margin from this may not compare as well as winter wheat, winter barley, but overall the whole farm using this will increase the gross margin average of all the crops.
Okay. I suppose that in a way that answers the last question. You've touched on what beans do for your rotation. It improves the soil, and it gives you that. It gives you more of those sort of first wheat entries. Do you agronomically, do you notice it doing anything in terms of, do you have any problems with grass weeds? Does it make those less of an issue?
No, not. I don't really have that problem. I must say the Nirvana sealer spray, which I use, and put on when the soil is moist, straight the day or the day after the crop's sown, it works extremely well. And it provides a good cover. And that, again, you need a fine tilt for that. You need to watch that. And I have mixed feelings about rolling that early in the season. You know, to roll a crop in the beginning of March, you not know much rain's ahead of you. And I think we're all aware, you go into the Cambridge roller, that water can lay on the top and cause all sorts of problems. So, you know, make sure the seed bed is fairly fine and you get a good soil contact from that spray and not cloddy. So, and generally no problem with grass weeds at all for annual ryegrass, or sorry, annual meadowgrass.
Okay.
And then your last question, you know, to suit my soil, to suit my land, I've tried oilseed rape in the past, and oilseed rape will do the same thing. It'll build up the organic matter if you chop the straw and do a similar job. But I've had mixed results with it, and I certainly have done these over the last 7 years, and they've worked well for me. So.
Okay. Okay. Well, I suppose I'll not ask all the questions because we'll hopefully have one or two come from our audience. But I suppose maybe at this point I'll sort of summarize sort of what we have found or what we would sort of suggest. And I suppose the first one, as both Charlie and myself have said, is that end use or your market really dictates your post-harvest treatment. You know, speak to your customer, figure out what they want, and sort of, you know, get plans in place to achieve that. Consider desiccation for crops that are weedy, unevenly ripened or late. You know, Charlie said he's sort of does that every year. However, there are people out there that maybe don't desiccate crops, and I suppose it's those that are particularly comfortable, maybe with them being that little bit later to harvest. So if you're on the right type of ground, and the crops, you know, the crops weed free, leaving them to come in themselves, you know, it is an option. When it comes to drying, if possible, that low temperature or ambient drying suits if the crop's harvested reasonably dry, and we'll say reasonably dry, sort of below 18%. It is possible just with blowing air through them, keeping them well ventilated, that you can bring the moisture down gradually. That will take quite a long time, but I suppose the important thing is to keep monitoring the crops in store, regardless of what you've done, whether you've dried them, whether you're just sort of ventilating them, or whether you've treated them with popcorn or some other kind of treatment. Is keep an eye on them, because any of them, if they're sort of not done properly and not monitored properly, can give rise to issues. So you want to keep an eye on what's going on in store. And I suppose the final point is to get the best rotational benefit out of having grown a protein crop is try to follow that in with a winter sown cereal. You'll hold on to more of that nitrogen, and it'll give you a higher yield potential than possibly a spring cereal the following year. Okay, so thank you very much for listening, folks. That's all I have at this stage, and I think I'm maybe going to hand back over to Robin. He might have a few questions for us. Is that right?
That's fine, Lee. Yes, thank you very much, Charlie and Lee. It was a good run through the considerations leading up to harvest now. See, everybody still has cameras on, so we're okay. Maybe we just kick off, maybe Dawn, with a question to you. Maybe give Charlie and Lee a wee break, so they've been talking. A question on here, sort of almost two-pronged. It's really a query on the scheme. Almost should be subsidising the cereal sector for growing protein when Northern Ireland isn't already sufficient in cereals. Would it be better to focus on teaching livestock farmers to make better silage or grow lucerne or red clover crops to get protein?
Yeah, well, that's a lovely one to start with. Thank you, Rowan. Sort of take it in the two parts then. The first bit about encouraging proteins. This, first of all, the real onus behind this came from the arable sector itself, who wanted to develop an alternative break crop from cereals, and beans were seen as a very suitable break crop, as Charlie has said. Now, what Charlie's also said is that at the moment, there isn't a huge margin in beans, so it was felt that it would be worthwhile to support the crop in a pilot program to develop the crop as in terms of its husbandry and its use, and promote it with end users at this stage. So the purpose of this scheme was to develop the homegrown proteins for that point. Yep, we do import a lot of cereal. There probably is merit in growing more cereals and developing that, but that will probably come in a longer term, more so in terms of sustainability of the Northern Ireland sectors as we go forward. This program was just a simple one to develop homegrown proteins on a limited scale as a sort of a initial project. In terms of supporting other crops, yes, I mean, we have no issue, and I mean, we would encourage the growing of other protein crops for livestock, such as lucerne and whatever, but it's very difficult then to determine, you know, this was very specifically for in an arable situation, although they can be, the beans can obviously be whole cropped. What the future is for those other protein crops is up for discussion with our policy colleagues now as they look at new options going forward.
Thanks, Don. I hope that answers the question. One other question here and on email, maybe just possibly for Lee and Charlie, maybe both to comment, and we've maybe touched a wee bit on it, but somebody has emailed in just concerned that looking at their crop at the minute, they think it may not be ready until into October. Is there a practical way of bringing that forward, even if it does mean a drop in yield?
Yeah, yes, well, I suppose desiccation, that's really the only thing that can do at this stage. I think that was one thing that was said back in March. Obviously, we're too far down the line to affect the drilling date. And the other thing, and maybe Charlie didn't actually mention it, but another thing is use of fungicides. So, you know, late drilling and sort of heavy use of fungicides will keep the crop greener longer. However, the sort of window for doing anything about either of those is passed. So at this stage, really, it's desiccation is the only thing that you can sort of do to help bring that crop in a bit earlier. And as Charlie said, it's not something you don't desiccate them and then, you know, get out in a week's time. It won't have done very much in a week's time. You really do have to leave it a minimum of 2 weeks. And possibly 3 weeks to really get the benefit out of it. So I suppose just on that, Charlie, you know, I know sort of having a chat with you before, when it comes to fungicide use, sort of what has your approach been to that? I mean, do you use a fungicide or?
In the early years, I used a fungicide, probably against my advisor's wishes. I stopped using a fungicide 4 years ago, probably for that reason, Lee, because it was keeping the crop really green right through into August. And it meant those years I was desiccating. I did desiccate, mind you, at the end of August. It was fairly green, probably only 40–50% black pods, but it was taking it a lot longer to ripen. And before I knew it, I was into the end of September. And from that experience, I stopped using that fungicide. And you know, this year we've had the dry spells. Disease pressure to me hasn't been an issue. I've been lucky. But that was probably one of the things I learned. If I want to get that crop harvested in good time and get my wheat in, because I do want to get my wheat in October and no later to get it well up.
And I suppose that really is the answer. Is just finding the right balance for you. How comfortable you're willing to leave them. Okay.
Maybe just now on the Dawn, you did mention there, you highlighted this as a 2-year scheme. Has there been any indication of thinking beyond that, or what way direction things might potentially go?
No, there's certainly no indication at this moment in time. The scheme, as I've said, was asked for by the arable sector as a means of developing beans as a break crop, possibly as an alternative to oilseed rape, and it has been run as such. So there's funding available for this year and next year, and then that will end. What will come after that will probably fall within a wider debate and consultation on policy going forward for all of Northern Ireland agriculture.
Thank you, Don. And just maybe, I suppose, possibly again to Lee and Charlie maybe, but as Don's mentioned, there is another year of this pilot scheme to run, and I suppose last year's scheme was launched sort of well into the springtime, in time for spring planting. Obviously this year there's a very small area of winter beans mentioned in this year's claims, but any potential for other winter crops of protein crops looking forward for this year? Anybody planning for planting in the autumn time now?
Sorry, happy enough to answer that one. I think it came up in Dawn's slide is that there is such a thing as winter sweet lupins. Now, having spoke to somebody at Soy UK who imports, I think, nearly all the lupins that are sold in the UK, his advice to me was that they have tried it in Hampshire and they have tried it in Suffolk and they haven't had great results. They're not winter hardy at all. A touch of frost and that's it, they're dead. So he said if you're south of the Loire Valley in France, that's okay. You can grow winter lupins, but any further north than that, you really are at a big risk. So they would be out. There are winter peas, but again, they're not suited to UK conditions, and they don't yield as well as spring peas. So really, for anybody that's considering a winter protein crop, beans are it. They are the only option. I suppose the only other thing that maybe mention is that work that Chuggas have done in the south is that they have actually sown spring bean varieties late winter. And when I say late winter, sort of November, December, January, you know, the early months of the new year. So they can get away with sowing them then, and seem to get on quite well with doing that. But again, their conditions are different to ours. They do tend to, in some of the parts of the southeast, have a lot drier winters, so they can sort of get away with late sowing that. Probably if you're sowing typically October, early November here, yeah, maybe better sticking with the winter varieties.
Charlie, have you anything you would wish to add on that, or any consideration to those? You've obviously stuck with the spring beans.
I often thought of winter beans, but my worry of that is the damage through pigeons and crows. And you know, when I do sow these in March, luckily I have a friend who likes shooting, and crows and pigeons can be hard on them if you don't watch, particularly if you plant near a coppice of trees or something like that there. I know and once they emerge, now this goes again probably a compromise with sowing depth. I don't want to go too deep at that time of the year because you want them to come up quickly, but at the same time, you're talking 2.5 inches or so down to try and stop that. But I've seen the crows just walking up them and picking out the plant and pulling out the bean and having a nice wee feast. So you can imagine what that could be like if you sow winter beans. They're there for the season, and some people have done them okay. I would be a bit worried, and those who I know who grow winter beans, the harvesting is a very similar time to the spring beans, as far as I know. There's no other crop I'd be interested in. The peas would put me off. I think I'd be worried that they could go down on you. The thing I like about the beans, and I try to look for a variety which is good standing power. The one I did have and I can't get is Boxer. It's a big bean with a thick stem, and it did well for me for the couple of years I had it. The peas, I would be worried that if you get a spell of bad weather, they might be difficult to harvest in the future.
Okay, Charlie. Another question just on here, in that would the crop be more brittle at harvest if it's sprayed off compared to not sprayed? Have you found you tried either option?
I don't
think it's brittle enough when I spray it off. Sorry, folks. One thing you did mention, you know, combine settings, and if it is a little, you know, you think of that leaf as like a paper cover over the seed, and if it's not dried out like paper and brittle, you will find a lot of that black stuff, and you always find some coming into the tank. It'll always be there, but you try to reduce that, and it looks unsightly, but it doesn't really amount to much. But you do see those black pods, the residue of those black pods come into the tank with the beans, and if they're damp, they're hard to blow off. So can't be brittle enough even with the glyphosate.
Yeah. I suppose what I would maybe add to that, and it's something if you sort of read Farmers Weekly and some of the English publications, you know, they would talk about that, about beans being too brittle. And you know, whenever it gets very dry and hot and warm in the middle of the day, you know, if they're harvesting probably at this time of year on a day like we had today, temperatures well over 20 degrees, that sort of say, well, you maybe, you know, you want to look out for pod shatter. I don't think I've ever seen that being an issue over here. If we got it to shatter, that would be a nice problem to have. But if we ever do get that problem, the sort of way around that is, if you've got a really brittle crop, is harvest a bit earlier in the morning when there's still a wee bit of dew or damp about, or later in the evening whenever it's sort of starting to sort of damp up in the evening, because that will hold those pods together. But generally speaking, that's not too much of an issue here. But having sprayed a crop off, I think, as you asked, is it going to be more brittle? Yes, it'll probably dry it out a bit more, but I don't think that will be much of an issue here. It would be a nice problem to have.
Thank you. And I think one final question I've here: how do you value the bean crop per ton? Anybody like to take that one?
I thought that was coming. I'm not going to tell you what I got for them. I'll give you a ballpark of how I work it out. What price is soya? Soya, what, about 46% protein? Am I right, folks?
Should
But
be.
remember, it's got no starch in it.
Yeah.
So my beans analysed were 24% protein. So about half the value of soya, plus a bit more to make up for the starch. So what's soya at the minute? 36 at the minute, but
Basically 80, yeah.
yeah, say, well, half that and add a bit to it in any year. And I've myself and my customer have our own deal, so I don't want to really give that away at this stage, folks. Thank you.
I mean, I suppose if
that gives you
anybody wants to
ballpark.
check, there is
Yeah.
also there's access on the HDV website if you want to check. There is a relative feed calculator thing which you can put in, and it tends to base most of them on the feed barley price and the rape meal price at that particular time. So you simply look up some of the reference sources, find the relevant prices of those, insert those, and it'll give you sort of a relative feed value, but it's probably somewhere close to what you're talking about, Charlie. So similar sort of figures.
Farmers Weekly is probably the first thing I look at every week, is what price is grain going from the week before, and beans are there and peas are there, and it sort of gives you a trend. Also, as I say, the HDB market report will give you soya, but the Farmers Weekly have that on the second page in. On the left hand side, all the commodities there, and peas and beans are there, so give you an idea of the way it's going. Yeah.
I think that's all the questions. Well, just a wee comment has come on there actually saying PGRO also publish a bean price, but you need to sign up to PGRO to get that as well. So that can be got as well. Just a comment there. So I think that's all the questions I have, folks, and that's just tying in nicely with our targeted time of an hour. So
sorry, Robin, there was just one more question I noted come in. That somebody had put, do you need a side knife in the combine for harvesting beans? I'll maybe just touch on that one briefly. No, you don't need it. It can be useful if you've got a laid crop, but it depends if it's lying into you. It's a good thing. If they're lying away from the heads away from you, it can actually cause them to shatter out. So again, it's probably just a case of playing about with them if you've got it. It's a nice thing to have, but it's not by any means necessary. I suppose it stops them sort of clogging up over the dividers and makes it a wee bit easier, but I've seen them cut with and without. All right.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to just thank all the panelists for taking the questions, and that brings us to an end of that part. So really that's all I've left to say, and wishing you a successful harvest of your crops this year. Hopefully the weather keeps like us to get the bulk of them cleared up. It makes life a lot easier. And I would just like to finally, once again, thank our panelists, Dawn, Lee and Charlie, and also you, the audience, for taking the time out on a good evening to join us for this event. And as I say, if you're talking to anybody else who maybe missed it or like to catch up, it will be available on the CAFRE website probably about a week's time or so, or as soon as we can get it processed and on there, but should usually take about a week. So thank you very much for attending, and good night to all of you. Thank you.